about this is that the Hebrew and Spanish bilingual children are learning to read in two languages where they have to learn that letters make sounds. And once you figure that out, letters can make sounds in any language. So their reading is advanced because they're boosted by this converging reinforcement for this crazy rule. Letters make sounds. Now the Chinese kids are learning to read characters. Letters don't make sounds. But they're figuring out what I just showed you on the previous slide, that print matters. Now, what this means is that until kids figure this out, when you're sitting reading a storybook with kids, and the kids reading along because they've heard that story 100 times, it's a favorite story, it turns out that until they've got all of this stuff straight, they have no idea why the story says what it does. And if you would ask them to point to the bit on the page that tells the story, it turns out they're just as likely to point to the picture. And that's not going to help them learn how to read. So all of this feeds into early literacy, and all of this is figured out earlier by bilingual children. Now, I'm going to move from language into this other part of it. One thing we know about bilingualism is that if you know two languages, they're both kind of active in your head and bumping up against each other all the time, kind of waiting to be selected. And that means that your mind needs to have a way to resolve this conflict. You've got two ways of saying something. You need a mechanism to sort out which one you're going to use. Now here's a picture of the brain, and it turns out there's a bit in the front part of the brain that is created precisely for resolving conflict. It's used for all kinds of conflict. And that's the part of the brain that is used to choose which language you're going to be speaking. Now the system, the cognitive system in that bit that I've circled in orange is called the executive control system. And its job is to manage attention, resolve conflict, and so on. It is the most important cognitive system we have. It's the last cognitive system to develop in childhood. It's the first cognitive system to decline with aging. It's our most expensive, most valuable cognitive system. It allows us to pay attention, to multitask, to concentrate, and so on. All right, so bilinguals use that system all the time, and using it makes it bigger and stronger. So the idea here is that because bilinguals have to use this system every time they open their mouth to speak, the executive control system is enhanced for bilinguals. And remember, this is the most important cognitive system there is. All right, I'm going to show you two little tasks that we use to see how children's executive control system is developing. Here's an example of how children are learning about numbers. So counting, it's a big insight for children when they realize that 5 is 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, there's 5 things. That's called cardinality. It's a very important concept. So here's one task. We call it the sharing task. Children have to divide candy between 2 dolls and make sure that both dolls have exactly the same number of candies, because it would be terrible if one doll had more candies. Then they have to count how many candies are in one of the piles, and then without counting, tell us how many are in the other. So you count, you have a number. Do children understand that that number is a quantity? So here's how it works. There's the dolls, and the children are told, divide all the candies so that both dolls have exactly the same number of candies. So they use this one for you strategy. Okay, do they have exactly the same number of candies? Yes, they do. Make sure children agree they're exactly the same. All right, how many candies does this doll have? All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This doll has 5 candies. Good. Okay, now without counting, how many dolls does this doll, how many candies does this doll have? Okay? Now, it's really a very simple question about understanding the meaning of cardinal quantity. Here's the results. Monolingual and bilingual children, exactly the same, all right? So this is a concept, and it develops in both children at exactly the same time. So now we take these same monolingual and bilingual children, and we give them a very slightly different problem. Now we tell them we're going to build apartment buildings. Each block is one apartment, and each apartment has one family living in it. Some families live in big apartments, and some families live in small apartments, but each apartment has one family. So we want to know, which apartment building has more families. Count the blocks and tell me which one has more families. It's essentially the same problem. Count and tell, okay? So which one has more? Let's look at this apartment building, okay? Now let's look at this apartment building. Which building has more apartments? Count the blocks, and it's this one. But sometimes they look at buildings like this. Here's one building, and here's another building. Which building has more families living in it? Count the blocks. Well, the right answer is this one, but we have a problem because this one is bigger. So how do these kids do? There's conflict. There's that word that keeps cropping up. Now, these are when the bigger building has more apartments. Both groups are the same. When the smaller building has more families, only the bilinguals can answer that. There's conflict. It's the same task. Count and say how many there are. But when you need to ignore this misleading information, you need executive control. And bilinguals have better executive control. So both tasks are the same, but in the first task, there's no misleading information. And in the towers task, there's conflict. So what we see here is that bilingualism leads to more rapid development of executive control. And you can see this advantage on all kinds of problems when there's conflict, when you have to ignore something that's leading you away from the right answer. But importantly, on all of the problems where there's no conflict, there's no difference. The bilingual children are not in general smarter. They don't have a higher IQ, but they are better equipped to solve problems that require concentration, attention, and thoughtfulness, and that's not bad. So what about Muzzy? We have found no evidence for higher grades, better test scores, or increased IQ, all of which are listed in this ad. There are indeed some advantages in early literacy. There are certainly no disadvantages. You won't compromise your child's ability to read in one language by also giving them the opportunity to read in another. There are no costs. There are clear advantages in executive control, and those last a lifetime. Those are some of my people who do this research. Thank you.
I want to start with something that we're not supposed to do because we're supposed to argue against each other. But there is one point on which we both agree, and that is that our trip here has been a wonderful experience. And I just want to repeat what Ellen said and reiterate how much we've enjoyed being here, how much we both have learned. And this visit to the school this morning was an amazing experience. I feel like I would like to be just a few years younger and be a student in that school. That would have been a wonderful experience. Your kids are very, very fortunate. And although I don't speak Chinese, I hope that you will take what I'm trying to say here seriously, that early birds do have an advantage. Ellen talked a lot about psychological advantages in bilingualism. I want to talk more about different languages in bilingualism. Bilingualism is something that everyone has an opinion about, and because we all have opinions about it, we also share a bunch of misconceptions. And what I'm going to do here is talk about some misconceptions which I often see as a linguist when I'm asked about bilingualism. So usually, if you tell people you're a linguist, they ask you two questions. The first one is, how many languages do you know? It's like asking a doctor how many diseases you've had. And the second question you get is, so what about bilingualism? And so I'm going to talk about several of those misconceptions that I've been trying to explain to various people. So the first misconception we come across quite a bit is that bilingual children are delayed in their cognitive development and are generally confused, and therefore it's probably not a good idea to raise a bilingual child or start early. And I don't need to say anything about that because everything you've just heard from Professor Bella's talk shows that this is not true. So we can quietly bury this misconception and move to the more interesting one, which is this one, which I also encounter a lot, where people say it's worth being bilingual or multilingual, but only in those languages that have global market value. And if it's a minority or a smaller language, it's not really worth maintaining. That's a very common thing you encounter. And the reason it's not true, again, goes back to what you just heard from my colleagues, the psychologist, and that is it doesn't matter what your 2 or 3 languages are because the cognitive and linguistic advantages remain the same regardless of the utility of a language. Moreover, people in this room are fortunate in that their kids speak 2 languages with very high literacy and very established literature tradition, but even if a 3rd, 4th language is something that doesn't have a written tradition, it still gives you a cognitive advantage. Bilingualism is not just knowing 2 languages. It also gives a child access to multiple cultures. And being able to maintain and manipulate those multiple cultures also requires some kind of a conflict resolution and the ability to exercise that dorsolateral cortex, which you saw on the slide, that executive control. So I hope that you will agree with me that it's not true. Bilingual children are more sensitive to linguistic facts. They have an extra advantage in learning still another language. And it's important for them being global citizens. And then let me remind you that what's useful today may not be useful tomorrow and vice versa. 100 years ago, English was one of those, poorly maintained languages who very few people cared about, and if you were an educated global citizen, your job was to learn French. And now nobody wants to speak French. 50 years ago, when the Russians sent the Sputnik into the space, everyone in every possible country rushed to learn Russian. Right now at Harvard, the enrollment for Russian is about 10 people a year. The enrollment for Chinese is about 400 people a year. So you see the picture. And so it's really important to remember that the utility of language is in the eye of the beholder. And there is also an additional element associated with this idea that it's only worth to maintain those languages which are worth maintaining. And the idea here is that the unworthy language is typically a language with a lower socioeconomic status. If in the United States, if you say language with a lower socioeconomic status, the first language you think of is Spanish. And recent research on Spanish bilingual children in the United States, especially in California, children who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, shows that these children still outperform monolinguals on some of the executive control and attention tasks, and that research essentially builds on Professor Bellestock's work. So this is a very important finding. So your language may be unworthy socially, and it still gives the child a significant advantage. Moving on to misconception number 3, that's a very common one, and I'm sure that some of you have thought about that or worried about that, and the idea is that let the kid first learn one language and then we'll introduce another language, right? So that's a very typical scenario. It goes back to this misconception we briefly discussed, and that is that you don't want the kid to be confused. Now, if you don't introduce another language at the same time, that deprives the child of critical input from the earliest stages. But the most important, most interesting data arguing against this misconception come from studies of deaf children. Of course, it's very difficult to diagnose if a baby is deaf. And so a lot of babies who were born deaf were diagnosed as deaf much later in life. That means that those children were not exposed to language until, let's say, 3 or 4. And research on these people shows that they never achieve the same fluency as children diagnosed in infancy and exposed to sign language. So in other words, a deaf child who starts learning American Sign Language or some other sign language at age 3 will always be a little behind in their linguistic knowledge compared to a child who starts from birth. That goes to the work by my colleague Rachel Membry. And stunningly, there are some deaf children who weren't diagnosed until, let's say, age 8. And so we imagine that this child grows up for 8 years completely deprived of language. So it's very difficult to recover from that. But luckily, we're not dealing with those situations here, and it still tells us that learning a language as early as possible is a good thing. Your children will not be confused. They can manage. They can manage 2 languages. They can manage 3 languages. In fact, we saw that in the school today, and again, that made me wish that I were a student in that school and could learn Mandarin at 2. So the best time for raising a true bilingual is infancy or early childhood. Don't lose that time. If you miss the baby years, still start soon, because every year that the child starts learning a language, if they start fairly early, gives them an advantage. So systematic exposure to a second language in kindergarten and elementary schools leads to better language development than exposure in middle or high school. And in that sense, I think Hong Kong leads a lot of countries because, let's say, in my own country, in the US, children routinely start learning a language in 6th, 7th grade. And in my opinion, this is not a very good idea. So don't learn from those mistakes. Don't do that. Okay. So now let's move on to another misconception, which people often express in countries where English is not the dominant language, and the idea is that I want my child to learn English, but I don't speak like him or like her, and so my English is bad for my child. Okay? Don't worry. British English is just one of the many Englishes spoken around the world, and that leads us to the concept of world Englishes. And so that you would believe me that I didn't invent the notion, I want to show you the journal, which has been around for 29 years now. It's called World Englishes, and it systematically presents research on different varieties of English spoken anywhere from American Samoa to Alaska. So research shows that each of world Englishes, in fact, helps create a sense of identity. So the work by the Australian Joe Lobianco, who has worked on various Englishes, the work by the British linguist Peter Trudgill shows the same. So children grow up with a sense of identity, and that's a very important thing. So it's important to recognize that your English may not be as bad. And children routinely learn over the accent of their parents, and that's why if you look at immigration patterns, the English spoken by children of immigrants in English-speaking countries is generally unaccented. So you wouldn't find a second-generation Cantonese immigrant living in the UK speaking with a Cantonese accent. With the advent of mass media, children are actually more likely to learn the peer variety, which is more appropriate to their age group. So even if you want them to speak like Prince Charles, he is old for them. That's not their age dialect. And you're laughing, but in fact, this is a very important concept in linguistics, the idea of dialectal variation, which goes not only by place, but also by age. The worst thing that can happen to a teenager is to sound like their parents. And that's a very important thing. That's something that you are operating against. And believe me, I have a 16-year-old, so I know from experience. How many people speak like him? Not too many. And your child is more likely to imitate The Simpsons. So if you're worrying that you're not speaking like Prince Charles, I would change your worry and start worrying about not speaking like the figures that they see in the media. So my bottom line here is this is truly a misconception. And if you want to follow the policy, one parent, two languages, feel free, because there is no harm in that. And in fact, some research, which we saw at the workshop yesterday, shows that it actually gives some beneficial results. Okay. So are there any downsides to bilingualism? I will just essentially agree with Ellen at the risk of not creating an argument. Bilingual children are usually slightly less and slightly late in talking, which may feed this misconception, number one, that they are delayed or confused. Bilingual children, as we saw from Professor Bellastog's presentation, may start with smaller vocabularies in each language. But this vocabulary can be increased through reading, and we already see that bilingual children are better at reading than monolinguals, even if they have to deal with two different scripts. So your child will start talking at age 2 rather than age 1, but then she or he will have a lifetime of achievement and will probably be talking longer than monolinguals, because we also know from Professor Bellastog's work that bilingual people are slower in developing dementia or Alzheimer's. So it seems like a small price to pay. And again, it's very hard to imagine when your child is in the nursery school that at some point they will be 88 years old and someone will have to worry about their ability to tie their shoes again. So some practical things, which come from my experience of working on what Professor Matthews referred to as heritage languages, which is languages learned in the home, where the parents didn't really insist on the continuation of the language, and the child basically went to be a good speaker of the dominant language and a not so good speaker of the home language. So I'm giving you some practical tips and tricks. And I'm sure there will be many more, and we'll discuss them in the question and answer period. Start early, because the best window of opportunity is in infancy. Be consistent. Try to speak to your child in the same language as much as possible, and at times it will be hard, but don't take the path of least resistance. And crucially, enlist the help of other people, the siblings, the grandparents. You can certainly count on the wonderful school your kids go to, but the family is critically important. One of the things we notice in the heritage language research is what I call the birth order rule. Typically, the older child is a better bilingual, and every next kid becomes a worse and worse bilingual. They will be more dominant in one language and weaker in some other language. But that older child may become your partner and may play a crucial role in setting the bilingual standard for younger siblings. And in fact, older siblings often tell us that they actually enjoy being a language teacher. They like setting the standard, and of course it helps their own language. So you're killing two birds with one stone. We have found, working on language attrition, that's heritage languages, that lower birth order strongly correlates with language loss. So when we see people in my lab, and we usually see Chinese speakers who cannot read, or Korean speakers who cannot read, or Spanish speakers who, despite the fact that the alphabet is the same, have no reading skills. So they're great, their English is great, they're all Harvard undergrads, but they cannot really do well in their home language. And you always ask them, do you have siblings? If the answer is yes, the next question is, do you have older or younger siblings? You wouldn't believe how strong this correlation is. The younger the sibling, the less their knowledge. And I'm sure that some people in this room can probably relate to this experience. So use all the help you can get. And what I want to show you is this little graph, which relates to some work done by a number of researchers who asked the question, how many utterances, how many sentences a day the child hears? It's about 5,000 or over 5,000 a day. Over a year, it's over 1 million utterances. So you cannot produce all that, even if you spend all the time with your child. So you need to be present there, but you also need somebody else for those much needed utterances. So if you do that, then hopefully you will have those early learners, and they will have the words that are so much needed, and they will maintain them and stay with this advantage over their entire life. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin the Q&A session shortly. Well, let me thank you for your enthusiastic responses. We've got a number of very good questions. Okay, here's one. When you say 5,000 utterances a day, does TV do the job? Do you believe there's a dominant language even though someone's bilingual?
I can do it. I think we'll agree. There's actually a lot of research on this. I'll tell you, you may be familiar with this product. It's a little bit like Muzzy. There's this product called Baby Einstein that was bought up by Disney. This is all true. You know,